Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How do international hotspots such as instability on the Korean Peninsula or instability in the Middle East adversely affect millions of people around the world? What are some other major problems that our leaders will be confronting in the 21st century, such as climate change and poverty? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You are watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today we're taking a look at a variety, really a potpourri of international problems ranging from instability in the Middle East to climate change and several others. My guest today is an expert on these issues. My guest today is Dr. John Stempel. Dr. John Stempel is the past director of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, USA. Dr. Stempel had a 23-year career with U.S. Foreign Service with assignments in Guinea, Burundi, Zambia, Iran, and India. His Middle East service from 1975 to 1979 provided background for his book, Inside the Iranian Revolution. His most recent book is Common Sense in Foreign Policy. Dr. John Stempel, welcome to Global Connections Television.
Thanks, Bill. Glad to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump into it in just a moment. We got a lot of hot spots to cover, and I only mentioned the tip of the iceberg. Let's talk about the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. You are one of about 37 foreign service schools in the world. And it's really quite prestigious that Kentucky, which was predominantly a rural state, maybe not so much now, with 4.2 million people, has this very prestigious entity called the Patterson School of Diplomacy. Basically, what is it? What do you do? How many students do you have?
Well, we're a master's degree program that was set up based on the will of the university's first president. And he foresaw in the early 1900s a need for this. And we have about 30 to 35 students a year come in. It's a 3-semester program. And people do internships during the summer, and we prepare people for careers in diplomacy, intelligence, defense work, international development and international organization work, and even we have people in banking and of course intelligence. And we've been ranked 15th in the country and 21st in the world, one ahead of Oxford. I always like to say that. But we are a very narrowly focused program in getting people ready for careers in international affairs. Mm-hmm. We draw our student body from around the world. We have about a third of our students are from foreign countries and different countries every year. So we have a lot of alumni in interesting places.
Mm-hmm. Well, if our viewers are interested, I'm sure many will be, they can go to uky.edu/Patterson School and get more information on this very interesting school and your curricula. Now, I mentioned, John, in the opening that you are the author of Common Sense in Foreign Policy. This is a very interesting book. Some diplomats have said, is that an oxymoron? But I'm not sure.
Other people have said short book, huh?
Short book, 2 pages. What is the thrust of Common Sense in Foreign Policy?
Well, the thrust of it is that, first of all, everybody needs to get involved or understand it. And secondly, foreign problems that may seem complex are easy if you just take a look at them with the same sort of common sense background. And I started writing it in the 04-05 period. I didn't finish it until 2008 because of the direction that America was taking. We were making some bad choices, and there was a lot of ideological talk in the air, and we were going down the wrong paths. And I started out with a quote from a famous Hoosier author that says, "It ain't what you don't know that'll hurt you. It's what you know, what you think you know that ain't so." And common sense is a way of getting away from the ideology and getting down to the brass tacks and going after serious issues. And people have taken it that way. And it's been snubbed by some of the worst characters in American foreign affairs, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, you know, when I was looking at this, and I noticed you had 6 points, and they were all very salient. 2 of them jumped out at me, though. One said, learn both sides of the problem, and the other said, think of the immediate cost and long-term cost of your policies. And of course, the most famous of all these over the past several years has been the invasion of Iraq, which has been depicted by many, many observers as the biggest foreign policy blunder in U.S. history, probably, going into a country where there was no threat to the United States, was not part of the al-Qaeda network. And of course, we see today that we've invested almost $1.5 trillion in there. 150,000 Iraqis have been killed. The place is on the brink of a civil war right now.
And it's been done basically to secure oil for China up to
Exactly.
this point. And it's interesting enough that the sitting Secretary of State, Colin Powell, opposed it. And yet there are still people today who say that this somehow achieved something. And this is a totally blind look at it. Now, there are other issues that we've got to deal with today, and if we mess them up as bad, the consequences could be much, much worse.
Briefly, what are a couple of them? I know we can't get into all of them, but what do you see as some of the ones that we're looking at? I know it could change tomorrow by the time this show airs. But
the most dangerous one, which will not have changed, no matter how long this show airs, is the India, Pakistan, Afghanistan situation. That is the place. It's number one on my list for where the next world conflict would start, or a major war would start. And nuclear weapons would undoubtedly get involved in this. So we're looking at first-class catastrophe. It's been managed so far. We're coming to some hard choices in Afghanistan, coming down the line. But this is a problem which will continue on until there's a major shift in the situation out there. The Iraqi situation, Iraq-Iran complex, is still difficult. There is some hope with the election of a new president who is a diplomat himself, and the new foreign minister is Western trained, United States trained. But the key problem there is the Islamic establishment, including the Supreme Ayatollah Khamenei, who's at best a second-rate mind, and who is a supreme ideologue in all phases. How that works out, again, could create problems all over the Middle East, not just in the Iraq-Iran area itself.
Now, the United Nations Security Council has applied sanctions against Iran in several different areas. The United States, other countries have embargoes and what have you on. But they have a new leader now with Hassan Rouhani, who replaced Mohammed Ahmadinejad. Do you think he might be a more moderate leader? I realize he does not have the power.
He is a more moderate leader. That and the new foreign minister together, it's clear that he wants his regime to work. And this morning's press, every last few days, have said, we'd really want to negotiate these issues, they're a problem for us, etc. And this is the best sounds that have come out of Tehran since this whole business started.
So there is a glimmer of hope, perhaps. We will keep our fingers crossed on this.
And the good part is the administration has said across the board, we're willing to talk, let's chat. And predictably in America, there are others who have said you can't trust the Iranians, you simply can't work out a deal. Well, you can trust them if the deal is a satisfactory one and you hold their feet to the fire. And it's the same kinds of issues we've faced since we got back into international affairs in 1940.
Exactly. Now, if we think of one of the most intractable problems in the Middle East, it has to be the chasm between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And of course, we think back to 2008, 2009, when there was a conflict between the Israelis and the people in the Gaza Strip. And we saw it was something like a 22-day conflict. it wreaked immense damage in Gaza. I think something like 1,600 Palestinians died. I think about 16 or 18 Israeli soldiers were killed. Over 5,000 Palestinians were injured. I think 1 out of every 6 buildings in Gaza was destroyed. It just was an absolutely devastating situation. And of course, it was sparked, as I recall, by a soldier, an Israeli soldier, shooting a young teenager who was in sort of a no person's land or no man's land. But right now we see that, and again, when this show airs tomorrow or the next day, this could all change. But we see that there are peace talks going on for the moment. How important are those peace talks, and how do you think it looks today? Because the situation, the status quo in that area cannot remain the same, because eventually the Israelis will be outnumbered. In fact, they're already almost outnumbered. But how important are these peace talks today, and if they break down, to pick them up tomorrow and focus on this problem?
Well, I think some sort of peace talks will continue, because even the hardline Israelis have understood that is a major problem that they've got to work out. Now, that problem also relates, curiously enough, to the Egyptian situation. The basis of peace in the Middle East has been the Egyptian-Israeli treaty. It was set up under Jimmy Carter at the
Camp
David conferences. Mm-hmm. But now, if that falls apart, if the new regime in Egypt and the workings out of the problems there decides to go in a different direction, that will greatly increase the Israelis' fear and uncertainty. It seems to me that there has been, for the last 5 or 6 years, the potential nucleus of a peace or an agreement, at least for short-term, build on long-term, between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Israelis are having to back down for some pretty extreme positions, but even the present prime minister is apparently willing to do that now. And I'm hoping, particularly as others help them out, the United States being one of the principal ones, that they will be able to work out a settlement. And again, long-term proposition. You can never tell if it's going to stick. The Syrian situation, again, bears on this. If the Syrian situation develops into an all-out carnage, well, it practically is an all-out carnage now. Mm-hmm. But if radical fanatics take over in Syria, that will again increase the Israeli uncertainty and make in some ways less likely a settlement, but also for the Israelis hold out the opportunity that if there is a settlement, it will ease their problems in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Syria. And we see there's been gridlock at the United Nations Security Council primarily because Russia and China do not want to see a rerun of the Libyan situation that took place. But even though the Security Council is gridlocked, you still have United Nations agencies, High Commission for Refugees, High Commission for Human Rights, UNESCO, Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UN Children's Fund. All these agencies are on the ground working with Syrian refugees. And there's still activity going on over there to try to provide assistance to them. But what type of roadmap is there? I'm at a loss to figure out what to do with that situation, because they're really, as they say, the good guys and the good people. You've got really a bad choice on both sides, it seems like, with the government and with the rebels to some degree.
There are no really good choices, and the alliances are so unstable in that particular situation that I think the best thing that can be done is simply gentle pressure on everybody to stop the fighting. Now, that may not work. It may be necessary to take some steps, and I think the Allied administrations, ourselves, the British and the France, need to really think about those things now while there's time. They don't necessarily have to say anything, but people ought to be burning midnight oil in the Quai d'Orsay in Whitehall and in the State Department.
Focus on this problem.
Exactly,
very true.
Yeah.
Well, if we could shift gears just for a moment from the peace and security areas to some of the other issues confronting people in the world, and we think back to 2000 when the UN the majority of the member states of the UN General Assembly adopted the UN Millennium Development Goals, 8 logical, practical goals to be achieved over a 15-year period by 2015 to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, empower women. How do you, as a professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy, how do you bring these goals? Do you focus on them? I know you do individually, but do you talk about the Millennium Development Goals
we focus
as a package?
When we're talking, particularly when we're talking about overall problems in our basic courses. You know, here's a set of problems, here's what the UN is doing. And I think it's true that over the last 10 or 15 years, international organizations play a greater point, not necessarily at the head of international problems, but in underlying and providing the basis for solutions. I have a student of mine who went to Darfur in a very dangerous position, and I got an email from him about 6 months ago that said, "Dr. Stempel, I really understand what you mean about development being dangerous work. I'm waiting for a truck to pick me up before the Northern or Southern Alliance comes in and sweeps through the area." And I found that to be interesting, because here's somebody who'd started out in diplomacy and then went to development and found himself in the same kind of danger that soldiers and diplomats do as well, and found it exciting.
Yeah, exactly. And we often don't realize that the things are so dramatically different in many developing areas of the world, where you have no physical infrastructure, you have no roads, you have no telecommunications system. It's just a totally different world, and it is very dangerous. You read where the aid workers, the UN World Food Program, they lose a lot of their people every year, truck drivers, people like that, trying to get food out to help people to keep them alive, yet the other side takes pot shots at them and kills them, or whatever the case might be. It's a very dangerous situation.
Well, this is a pure case of good works is not for sissies.
Right.
I mean, you have to. I told particularly the women in our group, I want you to be able to throw a bad guy out the window from 2 feet away. You must be able to defend yourself, even if you're going to work for the United Nations or the Food for Peace program.
And your students work, as you mentioned earlier, they work in all kinds of capacities. They're in the private sector, they work for the UN, they work for various governments, and just in a real variety of career opportunities, I guess.
Yes, and some of them go into intelligence work. We don't know where they work. I was mentioning before the program about walking in to give a briefing at an agency I won't name, and discovering 12 of my students sitting in the front row, and I had no idea that they had gone to work for them. And they said, "You can't remember our names, you have to forget who we are." I said, "Trust me, I don't want to put you in trouble."
That was quite a shock, a
Yes.
pleasant surprise.
Pleasant surprise, yeah.
Certainly, right. Well, not some, a large number of climate scientists, about 97% of the scientists out there, along with the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was set up in 1988. It's done 5, soon to be 6 major reports, along with many world leaders and even private sector people, have indicated they think the #1 problem we're confronting is climate change. There's no doubt about it, the climate is changing, the glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, desertification is taking place. This was an issue we didn't talk much about 20, 30, 40 years ago, but we're talking about it today. How do you incorporate that into the curricula at the Patterson School, and how important of a topic is it to focus on and to try to help deal with?
Well, this comes under the general heading of environmental issues. And I must say that increasingly over the last 5 to 6 years, people who've entered the school have been very open to careers in these areas. So we work it in that. We work it in the defense courses, which talk about the dangers of gas and other stuff like that. And it gets worked into the diplomatic angles. I'm preparing for the diplomacy course this fall, and I'm saying that there are problems out there that you have to deal with that aren't immediately diplomatic problems. And we get together and we make them do presentations on those and speak to these issues. Start now while you're a first-year student. And
exactly. Don't wait.
Don't wait.
Jump into it. That's
exactly.
very true.
And the interesting thing, our school is very practitioner-oriented. Where the professors may mess around with the great theories of international relations, but when it gets down, we give these to the students, says this is the best we're doing now, but your problem is the second level theory of where theory and action come together. That's why we've gotten the reputation we have had, I think, too.
That's interesting too, because the whole field of diplomacy, the whole area of foreign service training, I'm sure has changed. You've seen it change from maybe 30, 40 years ago. We were talking during the Cold War, we're talking about hard power. We use military force, that type of thing. We contain the containment theory, that type of thing, to keep one country contained from the rest of the world. But has that changed today? Are we moving more into soft power, realizing that we're sort of an equal amongst equals to some degree, that a large number of countries have to play a role in dealing with these problems? No one or two or three countries can resolve them. But is there a shift?
We're still in the process of getting there. You know, force is still important. It's going to be important, but it's not the answer. It's like the common sense issue. It's what you don't think you know that ain't so. That's the problem. We're having to retool. And frankly, it's easier at the younger levels. I think we have more problem at the moment with senior statesmen, if you could call them that, who are simply not as familiar with these changes. Now, these changes started when I came to the Patterson School in 1988. 1989 was the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's been going on. So most of my professional academic life has been working with and coping with those problems.
And it's fascinating to see what is out there today, and many of these problems are going to affect us, but more so into the future. At a White House luncheon, I think it was in 1954, Sir Winston Churchill was quoted as saying, "It's better to jaw than war." And if we look at an institution like the United Nations, the only institution in the world that brings together the 193 countries of the world, every conceivable religion, economic system, all 6,000 languages are included in that, under that one roof. You have just a real potpourri of the 7.3 billion people on planet Earth. Now, the UN's not always going to agree on things. The General Assembly and the Security Council don't always agree, but still, given that diversity, given the fact that they will argue and fight over certain things, but it's amazing that they agree on as much as they do, and that they have a UN system, I mentioned, like the World Food Program, UN Children's Fund, and what have you, that's out there doing day-to-day activities, working to help people, to keep them alive, to provide services to them. How important is it for us to learn more about the United Nations and not be a flag waver for the UN, be a critic of the UN, but to learn more about it and to realize that it's not a perfect organization, as Madeleine Albright said, but it is indispensable, that we need it, and we all need to try to make it a more efficient or more effective organization.
Well, I don't know of any school that studies this subject that doesn't cover the United Nations and how it operates. And I think that's a plus. That certainly wasn't true 30 years ago. I think another thing I think we have to work on is the interplay between the UN and individual countries, and particularly our own, because the UN is frequently becomes a whipping boy, unnecessarily so, I think, but for some people. And we have to have the broader picture. And it's really difficult because we're citizens and we spend more time on basketball, football than we do on international affairs, but we really have to get back there. And my job, certainly for the past 25 years at Kentucky, and I'm retiring in a few months, was to get people conscious of that so that they can deal with these issues. Everybody, not just students, but we encourage our students to go out and give talks. And sometimes they come back saying, people do know a little bit more about this, or more frequently, boy, they really don't know much about this. I said, now you're discovering why you're part of the elite, so get out there and keep talking to them, you see.
Exactly. And that is very, very true that we don't. I know the polls in the United States, the most recent one that came out, showed that it was huge. The polls show that the American public supports the UN anywhere from 48 to about 84% of the time, depending upon the issue. It depends upon what you ask them about. But the polls also, and this goes back to the creation of the United Nations in 1945. The founding of the UN, if you look at the Roper Poll or the Worthlin or Gallup or any of those along the way, they also show that the vast majority of us do not understand the United Nations, even though it impacts our lives every day. We're all affected by the United Nations, and it's an organization we need to learn more about and to be a constructive critic of the UN, because the UN is certainly not perfect. Anytime you bring together 193 countries under one roof, that's a recipe for a real challenge.
It is a challenge. And the other problem is, and it's true not just of our country, but of all the countries, when the UN gets into becoming a domestic political football, almost nothing good happens when you do that. Our focus should be trying to understand it, trying to do what we can, and trying to, if we can't do things through the UN, do things other ways, but contribute to the UN's capability to make things come out better.
Exactly. Well, Dr. John Stempel, it's a very interesting book, Common Sense and Foreign Policy.
I urge you all to buy it.
Sure many of our viewers would like to take a look at it, but I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. It's always fun to chat.
Good to see you. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for joining us on today's Global Connections program.